It was early morning. The air was still. I was standing right on my property line, calm, unbothered, when two HOA guards suddenly walked straight toward me. One of them raised his hand and said, "Stop. You can't go any further." I paused, looked down at the ground, then back at his face. "This is my property line," I said, steady and clear. He smirked, like he'd said this 100 times before. He tapped his radio, the second guard stepped closer, and then he dropped the sentence that told me this wasn't normal. "New HOA rules. As of today, you're not allowed to cross here." New rules? On my land? A few neighbors slowed down. Some stared. Some looked away. The guards grew more confident, like someone had handed them power they were itching to use. One of them leaned in and said, "You don't comply, you'll be fined. Next step is towing. Then we call the police." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move an inch. I simply slid my hand into my pocket and pressed record. They thought I was alone. They thought it was their word against mine. What they didn't know was that every threat, every lie, every false claim of authority was being recorded. And once the truth is captured, it's only a matter of time before power starts to shake. And the people abusing it realize they've crossed the wrong line. If you believe no one should be bullied on their own property, drop your city or country in the comments and let your voice be counted. Hit like to stand against abuse of power, and subscribe, because this channel tells stories where truth always exposes control. My property has always been my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe freely, work, and enjoy life without interference. Years ago, I bought this land with sweat and careful planning. Every corner, every fence, every path has been measured, surveyed, and marked. I know my property line better than anyone else. Recently, the HOA in my area grew aggressive. They started sending vague notices about community rules and compliance issues, though nothing ever applied to my property. I always respected the law and my neighbors, so I initially brushed it off. But slowly, the tension grew. The letters became sterner, and the tone in phone calls shifted. There was a sense of impatience and arrogance, as if they assumed I would simply comply. I'm the kind of person who documents everything: emails, letters, photos, even small conversations. It's not paranoia, it's preparation. I've seen how unchecked power can escalate if left unrecorded. And now, this preparation would become critical. Despite the looming pressure, I tried to maintain calm. I went about my daily routine, walking my property, checking the fences, making sure everything was in order. The HOA was looming like a shadow in the background, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me stressed. I was calm, silent, and observant, recording in my mind everything that could become important later. Neighbors noticed the subtle tension too. Some whispered about the HOA's overreach, others looked on silently, unsure of what might happen next. Yet, I felt no shame in standing my ground. This is my property, my life, my right. They could try to intimidate me, but they could never erase the truth or the law. Little did I know, the situation was about to escalate, quickly and aggressively. The HOA's guards, empowered and arrogant, were preparing to cross the line. And when they finally arrived, what I had documented quietly for weeks would become the difference between intimidation and justice. It started small, almost imperceptibly. A vague email from the HOA claiming that new community regulations might affect my property. I opened it, expecting another bureaucratic mix-up, but the tone was different this time, demanding, condescending, almost aggressive. They wrote as if they already had authority over my land, even though I had lived here long before they even existed. A few days later, the first guard appeared. He didn't knock politely. He didn't ask. He simply stood at the edge of my property line, arms crossed, staring at me like I owed him something. His radio crackled, and I could hear a faint voice giving orders. I asked him calmly if he had a legal notice. He shook his head. "We're just here to enforce the rules," he said, vaguely, as if that explained everything. It didn't. It never did. Every attempt I made to get clarity was met with vague threats. You could be fined. You might be in violation. We have authority to act if necessary. Each phrase was designed to intimidate, to erode my sense of security on my own property. And slowly, I realized they weren't bluffing. They wanted to assert control, and they were testing boundaries. The second time they came, the confrontation escalated. They parked their truck across the path, blocking access to part of my property. I walked slowly toward them, hands visible, calm, yet firm. "This is my land," I said. "I have every right to be here." One of the guards leaned toward me and said, "We don't decide rights. HOA does." The arrogance in his voice was suffocating, as if the world had flipped upside down and I was suddenly a trespasser on my own property. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Multiple visits, increasingly aggressive stances, repeated vague threats. I noticed subtle tactics to unsettle me, moving objects, standing closer than necessary, occasionally glancing toward my cameras with sly expressions, testing whether I noticed. Their goal was clear: make me question my own rights, make me anxious, make me feel trapped. But I had prepared. Every interaction, every confrontation, every threatening word was recorded. My hidden cameras silently documented everything: the way they blocked paths, the conversations, their gestures, even moments when they whispered to each other about what to do next. Neighbors began noticing the tension too. Some gave concerned looks, others whispered about the overreach of the HOA. One even asked if I had thought about filing a complaint. But I knew patience and strategy would win here. Every false claim, every aggressive move, every misstep would be exposed if I stayed calm and collected. Then came the day they tried to cross the line in a way that could not be ignored. The guards attempted to physically prevent me from walking to a section of my property, completely disregarding my clearly marked property lines. I stood firm, my phone and cameras ready. The guards demanded I step back, claiming a rule that didn't exist. One even raised his voice, asserting authority that had no legal basis. And in that moment, everything changed. The intimidation tactic, the presence, the aggression, the threats, began to crumble. The real power had been quietly building on my side, the record of truth. Every lie, every fabricated rule, every moment of bullying was being captured in high definition. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight. I simply stayed calm, collected, and ready. The HOA had escalated, believing that sheer intimidation would force compliance. But what they didn't realize was that their own aggression was setting them up for exposure. Every action they took, every false claim, was another piece of evidence waiting to be revealed in court. By the end of the week, it was clear the power dynamic had shifted, though they didn't know it yet. The guards thought they were in control. The HOA thought they were enforcing authority. And I knew that patience, preparation, and recorded truth were about to turn the tables in a way they could never anticipate. This was no longer about property. This was about principle. About exposing lies. About proving that intimidation only works if the truth remains hidden, and in my case, the truth had been quietly documenting every move all along. The morning sun barely lit the driveway when the HOA guards returned. This time, it wasn't a casual appearance or a subtle test. They had come fully prepared to assert control. I could see it in their posture, arms stiff, radios at the ready, eyes scanning every inch of my property as if it belonged to them. Behind them, the first hints of Karen, the HOA president herself, appeared, her silhouette unmistakable even at a distance. She radiated arrogance, the kind of confidence that comes from assuming nobody will challenge her authority. As I stepped forward, calm but deliberate, the first guard barked, "Stop right there. You're not allowed beyond this point." I took a breath, and in a clear, steady voice replied, "This is my property. You have no right to block me." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Karen's voice cut through like a whip. "You're in violation of the HOA's new emergency rules. You will comply immediately, or face consequences." I paused. Emergency rules? Signed by whom? Filed where? My mind was already running through the documentation I had, the records of previous threats, the clearly marked property lines, the emails, the notices, all meticulously kept. I held my hand slightly in my pocket, keeping my phone ready. The guard stepped closer. One of them leaned toward me, trying to intimidate, but I didn't flinch. I knew the moment had arrived where patience, preparation, and calm would outmatch aggression. "Show me the official filing," I said quietly. "Where is the document signed and recorded?" Karen's face tightened. She shifted uncomfortably. We'll provide it," she stammered, her confidence cracking just slightly. The first guard tried to speak over me, but I held up a hand. "I'm asking the official document. Nothing else matters." The tension escalated as neighbors began to watch from behind fences, some recording with their phones. Karen's usual aura of control began to falter. The guards whispered among themselves, and I could hear fragments. "Are you sure about this?" "We were just following orders." For the next several minutes, the confrontation spiraled. Karen tried to assert power by raising her voice, claiming safety violations that didn't exist. The guards, emboldened by her presence, blocked more of my access, gesturing aggressively, attempting to corner me. But I remained calm. I documented everything in real time: video, audio, my notes. Every lie, every overreach, every misstatement was being captured. Then came the subtle twist. One of the guards accidentally admitted aloud, thinking I wasn't recording. "The HOA told us to stop him. Don't let him move past this line, no matter what." I froze for a split second, adrenaline surging. I knew that phrase alone was explosive. It directly contradicted the facade of lawful authority Karen had tried to maintain. I kept my composure, but inside, my heart raced. The power dynamic had shifted subtly but irreversibly. Karen attempted to regain control, shouting for me to leave, threatening fines, towing, and even law enforcement intervention. I didn't argue. I didn't comply. I calmly reminded her again, "Show me the official order. Until then, you have no authority here." For over an hour, the standoff continued. The guards tried every tactic: blocking, looming, subtle intimidation, but every move they made was recorded. My hidden cameras caught the gestures, the whispers, the lies, the inconsistent statements. I realized then that the confrontation itself was becoming the evidence needed to dismantle their false authority. The neighbors' presence became significant. Some whispered encouragement, others filmed secretly. The public gaze amplified the pressure on the HOA. Karen's usual confidence began to crack, her voice rising and falling unpredictably as she tried to maintain dominance. The guards were visibly uncomfortable, exchanging glances, uncertain of how to proceed without proof to back their threats. By the end of the day, the confrontation hadn't escalated to physical violence, but it had reached a critical tipping point. The HOA had publicly demonstrated their willingness to overstep boundaries, their lies were exposed to a live audience, and the evidence was now irrefutable. The tension, the intimidation, the fear, they had all been captured, ready to be presented in court. At that moment, I knew the fight had moved from my driveway to the courtroom. The open confrontation had set the stage. The aggressors believed they held power, but every false claim, every overreach, every aggressive tactic had been recorded, preserved, and catalogued. What seemed like intimidation was, in reality, their own undoing. The day of the court hearing arrived like the calm before a storm. I walked into the courtroom, fully prepared, carrying only my folder of documents, recordings, and evidence. Across from me sat Karen and the HOA board, their expressions a mix of arrogance and unease. The guards, who had once seemed so confident on my property, now avoided eye contact. There was an unspoken tension in the room, as if everyone could sense that control was about to slip from their hands. The judge entered, and silence fell. The proceedings began with standard introductions, but the air was electric with anticipation. Karen started confidently, presenting what she claimed were official HOA documents that validated their authority to block me on my property line. She spoke with certainty, gesturing to the papers and explaining the emergency HOA rules as if they were law. Then came my turn. I calmly handed the judge my folder. Inside were carefully organized documents, previous HOA notices, my property survey, timestamps of my recordings, and, most importantly, the video footage of the confrontation on my driveway. The judge raised an eyebrow as I explained how the guards had repeatedly blocked me, threatened fines, and even mentioned towing, all under the guise of authority that didn't exist. The turning point came when the court played the recordings. The first guard's words, spoken aloud without realizing he was being recorded, reverberated through the courtroom. The HOA told us to stop him, don't let him move past this line, no matter what. Murmurs ran through the courtroom. Karen's confident smile faltered, replaced with tension. Her carefully constructed narrative began unraveling. The recordings, paired with the clear survey records, proved that the so-called emergency rules were not only never filed with the county but were fabricated after the fact to intimidate me. The judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the documents and videos. Questions were sharp, precise. When were these rules filed? Who signed them? Where is the official record? Karen stammered. She had no answers. The HOA board shuffled uncomfortably, realizing that their carefully planned intimidation strategy was collapsing in real time. The judge paused, turning toward the guards, asking them to recount events from their own perspective. Their statements, now under oath, contradicted each other. One admitted he had acted solely on verbal instructions from Karen, without any legal authority. The judge then addressed Karen directly. This document was never filed. You have no standing to enforce it. Gasps echoed quietly through the courtroom. Karen tried to interject, but her voice lacked authority. The recordings, timestamps, and my meticulous documentation had created an undeniable record. Every lie, every false claim, every overreach was now exposed in front of witnesses and the court. It was at that moment that the full weight of the twist hit everyone. The very aggression the HOA had used to intimidate me on my property, the threats, the false rules, the guards, had become the evidence that would destroy their credibility. Their power, once so threatening on my driveway, was now their undoing. The courtroom shifted from tension to stunned silence. The HOA's arrogance had blinded them to one critical fact: truth has its own momentum, and when properly documented, it is unstoppable. My calm, measured approach, combined with preparation and proof, had turned the tables completely. By the end of the hearing, Karen and her board were left scrambling. Their lies, recorded and timestamped, were now undeniable. The judge had the evidence he needed to make a ruling. And as I watched the realization dawn on their faces, I knew the next step would solidify the victory, a judgment that would expose their abuse, restore my rights, and send a message that intimidation and fabricated authority have limits, even for a powerful HOA. The twist was complete. What began as a confrontation on my property line had escalated into a courtroom revelation. The people who thought they held power were now completely exposed. The truth had emerged, undeniable, irrefutable, and unstoppable. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the proceedings. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents I had submitted, the video recordings cued to play on the screen, and the HOA representative sitting across from me. Karen, the HOA president, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her usual aura of dominance had all but vanished, replaced by visible tension. The guards, once so confident on my property, now sat stiffly, realizing they had been caught in a trap they could not escape. The judge cleared his throat. "We will review the evidence submitted by both parties," he said, his tone calm but authoritative. The first piece of evidence, my video recordings of the guards blocking me on my property line. The screen illuminated the room as every moment of intimidation played in real time. My phone, my hidden cameras, and even a neighbor's recording captured their gestures, their whispers, their false claims of authority. Every lie, every attempt at intimidation, was displayed for everyone to see. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Karen's confident smile faltered, and she whispered to one of the guards. They tried to explain away the evidence, claiming misunderstandings, verbal orders, or miscommunication. But the judge's sharp eyes were not fooled. He paused the video at key moments, the guard saying, "The HOA told us to stop him, don't let him move past this line," and the inconsistencies in the documents Karen had submitted. The judge leaned forward, speaking directly to Karen. "This document was never filed. It has no legal standing. Your so-called emergency rules have no authority over the plaintiff's property." The room fell into stunned silence. Karen's lips trembled as she attempted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her attempts to assert dominance crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Then came the cross-examination. The guards were called to testify. Under oath, their earlier statements of confidence on my property were dismantled. One admitted that he had acted solely on Karen's verbal instructions without any legal authority. Another confessed that he had felt uncomfortable but followed orders because he believed the HOA had the power to enforce them. Every admission, every hesitation, every contradiction was another nail in the coffin of the HOA's credibility. I remained calm throughout. I didn't need to raise my voice or plead my case emotionally. The evidence spoke for itself. My property survey, the timestamps on the recordings, the letters, and emails, they all combined into a narrative so clear and compelling that there was no room for dispute. The courtroom, once a place of tension, became a stage for the complete exposure of the HOA's deception and abuse of power. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. The HOA has overstepped its authority. Its actions constitute harassment and intimidation. The plaintiff is fully within his rights to access and use his property without interference. The HOA is hereby ordered to cease all enforcement attempts, and damages are awarded for the distress caused. The impact was immediate. Karen's face went pale, her confidence shattered. The guards slouched in their chairs, silently acknowledging that their actions had contributed to the HOA's downfall. The judge continued, emphasizing the importance of respecting property rights and the dangers of assuming authority without legal basis. Every word underscored the lesson: intimidation and lies may seem powerful, but truth, when documented and presented, is unstoppable. As I gathered my belongings, the courtroom spectators whispered among themselves, some nodding in admiration, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I walked past Karen, who avoided my gaze entirely. Outside, neighbors approached me quietly, congratulating me and remarking on how the truth had finally prevailed. For the first time since the confrontation began, I felt a deep sense of relief. The fight had moved from the driveway to the courtroom, and justice had been served decisively. The HOA had been publicly exposed, their lies documented and undeniable. What began as a simple attempt to intimidate me on my property line had transformed into a legal and moral victory. The climax wasn't just the ruling, it was the complete collapse of the HOA's false authority in front of witnesses, in front of the law, and in front of those who had once feared their power. Every threat, every false claim, every act of intimidation had backfired spectacularly. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place for legal proceedings, it became a stage for truth, for justice, and for the undeniable lesson that when power is abused, the law will find a way to restore balance. The HOA guards had been confident, Karen had been arrogant, but in the end, the truth had won, and justice had spoken loudly. After the courtroom battle, I returned to my property with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The guards never came back, and the HOA's threats had crumbled into silence. Walking along the property line, I looked at the markers, the fences, the paths I had worked so hard to maintain. Everything was as it should be, untouched and under my control. Neighbors came by quietly to offer congratulations, some still shaking their heads at how boldly the HOA had overstepped. But this victory wasn't just about me, it was a message to anyone who assumes power without accountability. The intimidation, the fabricated rules, the false authority, they all failed because the truth was documented, prepared, and unwavering. I realized then that standing firm doesn't require anger, but clarity and patience. Recording the facts, maintaining composure, and trusting in the system allowed justice to unfold naturally. What had begun as harassment and fear ended in empowerment and vindication. As I looked out over my land, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They tried to block me, to intimidate me, to erase my rights, but the law, evidence, and patience had spoken louder than their arrogance. Some lessons can only be learned through confrontation, and some victories are sweetest when earned through truth. This is my property. This is my life. And no false rule, no intimidation, can ever take that away.